The wind howled across the empty fields the day Alara first stood at the broken wooden gate of the farm that now belonged to her. The sign that once carried her husband's family name hung crooked, one nail missing, swaying as if unsure whether to stay or fall. She wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped forward, boots sinking into mud that had not been turned in months. This was her inheritance. Not money, not comfort, just land that had forgotten how to bloom. The farmhouse leaned slightly to one side, its white paint peeled and tired. The windows were dusty, the porch sagging in the middle like an old back bent from years of labor. Inside, the air smelled of hay and silence. She could almost hear her husband's laughter in the corners. But memory was a cruel companion. It stayed warm for a second and then vanished, leaving the cold behind. Behind the house stood the barn. One door was half open, creaking as she pushed it wider. Inside, in a narrow stall, stood the skinniest cow she had ever seen. Its ribs pressed sharply against loose hide, eyes large and uncertain. Beside it, wobbling on fragile legs, was a small calf with a patch of white shaped like a crooked star on its forehead. The calf looked at her with innocent curiosity, unaware of hunger, unaware of loss. "So it's just us now?" she whispered. The villagers had shaken their heads when the will was read. A young widow, barely 26, no brothers, no father, no sons. What could she possibly do with a dying farm? They had offered polite condolences and quiet predictions of her failure. Some even suggested she sell it quickly before it swallowed her whole. But selling it would mean selling the last piece of her husband's dream. That first night, she sat at the wooden kitchen table, candlelight flickering over unpaid bills and faded farm records. The numbers did not lie. The soil hadn't been fertilized properly in 2 seasons. The crops had failed twice. The well pump needed repair. And the cow, if it did not gain weight soon, would not survive winter. She pressed her palms together, steadying her breath. She had never run a farm alone. She had helped, yes. She had milked cows, gathered eggs, planted seeds. But the heavy decisions, the bargaining at the market, the repairs, those had always been her husband's responsibility. Now they were hers. Before dawn, she rose. Grief did not excuse hunger, and the animals could not wait for tears. She mixed what little feed remained, adding warm water to soften it, murmuring softly to the cow as it ate. The calf nudged her hand, searching for milk, and she felt a fragile thread of purpose tighten inside her chest. Days turned into a rhythm of aching muscles and stubborn determination. She repaired fences plank by plank, her fingers blistered and raw. She learned to lift hay bales with her knees instead of her back. When the old tractor refused to start, she opened its rusted belly and studied its parts with borrowed manuals, grease staining her cheeks like war paint. Some nights, exhaustion pressed so heavily on her bones she thought she might collapse right there in the field. But each time she looked at the calf, growing just a little stronger each week, she felt something inside her refuse to break. Money ran thinner than patience. She began walking to the market with baskets of wild berries she gathered at the edge of the property. She sold homemade butter churned from the cow's improving milk supply. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy better feed, enough to patch the roof before the autumn rains. The villagers began to notice. They noticed that the cow no longer looked like a shadow of itself. Its coat slowly regained a soft sheen. They noticed the calf running clumsily across the yard, kicking up dust in playful rebellion against its once fragile legs. They noticed the small vegetable patch behind the house, rose straight and proud, green leaves pushing confidently through soil that had once seemed dead point one evening. As the sun melted into gold across the fields, a neighbor approached the fence. An older man who had once advised her to leave. "You're still here," he said quietly. She wiped sweat from her brow and nodded. "I am." He studied the barn, the repaired gate, the smoke rising from her chimney. There was something new in his eyes, not pity, respect. Winter arrived harsher than expected. Snow blanketed the fields early, and icy winds cut through the cracks in the barn walls. She spent nights inside the stall, wrapped in blankets, keeping a lantern burning so the animals would not freeze. She sang softly to the cow when it shivered. She fed the calf by hand when the mother's milk ran low. There were moments she nearly gave in. Moments when her hands trembled too hard to hold the bucket. When loneliness roared louder than the wind outside. But every sunrise she whispered the same promise. Just one more day. Survive one more day. And she did. By spring, the impossible had begun to unfold. The cow, once skeletal, stood sturdy and calm. The calf had grown into a lively young heifer, strong enough to nudge open the barn door with playful defiance. The vegetable patch doubled in size. Wildflowers crept along the edges of the field as if drawn by her persistence. The farm no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive on the anniversary of her husband's passing. She stood in the middle of the field at dawn. The air smelled of new grass and damp earth. She closed her eyes, not in sorrow this time, but in gratitude. She had not saved the farm alone. She had been saved by it. The skinny cow and her calf had given her more than milk or income. They had given her a reason to wake up when grief tried to anchor her to the bed. The cracked soil had given her something to fight for. The broken fences had taught her patience. The silence had taught her strength. She opened her eyes as the calf trotted toward her, brushing against her side affectionately. In that simple touch, she felt the truth settle deep in her heart. She was no longer just a widow surviving what was left behind. She was a farmer rebuilding what others had already buried. The wind still moved across the fields, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like possibility.